Here we have a base mesh created in Maya, which I want to bring into Mudbox. So let's go ahead and select the mesh and send it to Mudbox as a new scene. And when I bring it in, you'll notice that we get this message about problems detected on the imported mesh. Incomplete UV set, some UVs too close together. And then I have the option of deleting this mesh or keeping this mesh. I'm going to go ahead and keep it, and we'll take a brief look at it. So here's my mesh. Some of the problem areas are indicated with these red dots. And if we go to UV view, you'll see the UVs for my character, which indicates some of the problems that we have with this mesh. Let's return to Maya and take a look at it there and see what we can do. Now, this base mesh, which I've named Mr. Extrude, was created almost entirely using extrudes. In fact, I started modeling this using a polygon cube and then created everything from the arms, legs, feet, fingers using the extrude tool. And because I started with a cube, our UVs look the way that they do. These are more or less the default UVs for a simple polygon primitive cube. I'll create one and we can compare. Here's my cube, and you can see the UV layout here. And if I select my character, notice how his UVs line up exactly with the UVs on this simple polygon primitive on this cube. And that is, once again, because I modeled this character entirely from extrudes, starting with a polygon cube. So what exactly is the problem with these UVs? Well, let's return to Mudbox and see what the problem is. Now, generally, the problem is not going to be with the sculpting in Mudbox, but rather with creating our textures. So I'm going to switch over to my paint tools, select my paintbrush, and we'll just see what happens when I paint on this character. It's asking me if I want to paint a diffuse layer, or in other words, a color layer. I will say OK, and start painting on it. As you can see, actually it's allowing me to paint on it just fine right now. But if I paint on some of the other areas here, you'll notice I get some strange results. For instance, here, if I try to paint across this edge here, it appears to not let me do so. And if I paint over on some of these other edges, it paints somewhat down the whole leg here. So what is happening here? We'll return to Maya and figure this out. So here we have our mesh in Maya, and when we enter the UV editor to take a look at its UVs, we can take a look at some of the different parts on our mesh. For instance, if I select this face here in the chest area of my character, you'll see that that is this area on my UV map right here. Or if I were to select this face here on the arm, then notice where that is. And I'm not getting a clear indication of two-dimensional space for that particular face that I have selected. Here, this definitely has some two-dimensional space, as does this face here, but this one does not. This is an interesting contrast because they're right next to one another. We've got this face here, and then this face here. Notice that this one looks more like an edge when I have it selected, and that's because it has no 2D space. If we select the hand area, we get this. If we select the entire arm, notice how the arm is actually overlapping that whole area of the hand, meaning that they're sharing the same UV space, and that won't work when we want to paint our textures. Now, there are a number of different solutions for this problem that will allow us to paint textures on our meshes and sculpts in Mudbox, and we'll take a look at some of those options now. So one of the options, before I bring it into Mudbox in Maya, what I can do in my UV editor with my UV toolkit selected here, or with my UV toolkit open here, I can come over to this area here, Create, which gives me a number of different options for creating my my UVs as a starting point, let's say. So I'm going to try the automatic technique here. Automatic meaning it's very simple. It's simply the press of a button, and actually let me redo that. I meant to do that on the object itself, not on the components. Automatic, and here is what we get. So automatic will work. These UVs will work because everything has unique UV space in it. One thing I would do before sending it to Mudbox would be to simply scale it in ever so slightly like this. The reason being you don't want your UVs to come all the way to the edge here. Mudbox will complain about that. So let's go ahead and try sending in this mesh into Mudbox now and see how well it works. So with my mesh selected, I'll go to File, Send to Mudbox, Send as New Scene. It asks me if I want to save this scene. I'm going to say no. And it actually came without any complaints. Once again, if we want to take a look at the UVs for it, you'll see them here. And if we wish to paint on our mesh here, we can do so and shouldn't have any problems with it. Those areas that were problematic before, you can see that we can paint on it just fine. I'm going to return to Maya because we'll take a look at some better solutions. So what is the disadvantage to that automatic mapping? It was so easy to do, so that's a huge plus for it. But one of the downsides is that it creates a lot of different UV shells. Each one of these shells that I'm selecting is an example of a UV shell. And in some cases, you can see some of these UV shells, such as this one or this one, is quite small. On top of that, another downside to the automatic mapping is not just that it creates so many UV shells, but it's also harder to read. I'm not sure necessarily what I'm looking at. This current UV shell that I have selected, I actually don't know what part of the character that is. Let's find out. And it turns out it is this part on the foot. It's the toe area on the right foot. But the UV layout itself here really gives me no indication of that. So while the automatic setting here is great in that it is really easy. It's the simple push of a button and more or less you're done creating your UVs. You have functional UVs that will work for painting textures on your character. There are some obvious downsides. So if you understand how to do UVs, how to use these various tools in your UV toolkit to get a better layout, better UV mapping, you're better off doing that. And while I'm not going to go into great detail on the techniques for doing that in this video, you can watch some of my other videos to learn how to create good UV mapping for your meshes. For this particular example, I'm simply going to do it, and you can watch how I do it, but I'll be speeding up the video. So I've completed my UVs here. We can take a look at them here, and you can see that they're well organized. They're easy to read. It's easy to tell what is what. Let's select some of those UV shells so that you can see what corresponds to what here. This is the back. This is the front of the character here. And we've got the feet. I could rearrange these so that they are more in, usually I'll make it reverse these, so then perhaps the right foot would be here and the left foot here, but I'm not going to bother with that here. In other words, you can see that this is a good layout. It's easy to read. It's easy to tell what is what. In fact, let's contrast that with the other example of the automatic mapping. I'm simply going to duplicate this mesh, and we'll do the automatic mapping on it one more time. And hopefully you can see the benefit of doing the UVs yourself rather than relying on the automatic mapping method. Because this is much more complicated and much harder to read, much harder to work with, utilizes the space less efficiently than this UV layout here. So I'm going to select this one they did the automatic mapping on, delete it, and let's see how well this goes into Mudbox. I'll go ahead and go to File, Send to Mudbox, Send as New Scene. I'm not going to be saving this, and it came in just fine. And if we go to the UV view, you'll see that the UVs are just as we set them up in Maya before importing it into Mudbox. So before wrapping up this video, I'm going to show you one more thing. I'm going to show you a solution in Mudbox for eliminating the need for really doing any UV work on your model. Now, understand that with the ease of it, it also comes at a cost. It has its pros, it has its disadvantages. So I've reverted back to the older mesh, the one that hasn't been UV unwrapped. And in fact, if we come over here to the UV editor, you'll see that once again, my UVs look like the UVs of a polygon cube, because remember that that's how I actually modeled this character, starting with a polygon primitive cube, and then simply working with extrudes to create the arms, the fingers, etc. Let's go ahead and bring this into Mudbox and see what we can do. So, select the mesh, File, Send to Mudbox, Send as new scene. I'm not going to save this one. I once again get this these problems detected in the imported mesh where it has the incomplete UV set and some UVs are too close together. We'll go ahead and keep this mesh. Nevertheless, we know that if we start painting on it, we're going to have some problems with it. Because not everything has unique UV space. So you can see that I end up with these problems. I end up with areas that end up getting painted on without me actually painting on them, and when I actually try to paint on them, I'm unable to. So what is the solution for this in Mudbox? Well, let's take a look. So what I can do is go to UVs and Maps, PTEX Setup. I get this pop-up asking, it says, the mesh, Mr. Extrude, has UV paint layers. What do you want to do with the existing paint layers? We're going to delete them. We don't want to keep them. And now we get this PTEX setup where we can either decrease or increase the current resolution. I'm going to keep it on its default, and I'm simply going to say done. Now we get this message saying that the mesh is prepared for PTEX, for the PTEX mapping and for painting. So now that we've done that, let's see how we can paint on this mesh. And as you can see, I can paint everywhere just fine on it. It works very well, in fact. There should be no issues with painting on this mesh now. So what exactly are the disadvantages, considering how easy it was to apply this PTEX mapping to this? What is the disadvantage? Well, let's take a look. If I go to my UV view, you'll notice that we get a message saying Mr. Extrude is currently using PTEX painting and has no UVs. So this PTEX setup is really good for working in Mudbox, but for bringing your character back into Maya or into a game engine such as Unity, you're going to probably prefer to have your your mesh UV unwrapped, UV mapped, because that's going to work better typically for your materials and shader. In fact, let's go ahead and see what happens if we send this mesh back to Maya. I'm going to go to File, Send to Maya, Send selected as a new scene. And here it is. Press 6 so we can look at textures. Select our mesh, go to my UV editor, and here's what we've got. So while everything on our mesh does indeed have unique UV space, you can see that this actually makes even less sense than our automatic mapping that we looked at earlier. So my advice regarding using the PTEX setup found under UVs and maps is that if your sculpt is never going to actually leave Mudbox, then it's a perfectly fine solution that's going to give you what you need, and it's going to require very little effort. So I think that the PTEX setup certainly has its advantages, but just always keep in mind what your ultimate goal is with your models, your meshes. Is it to work in Mudbox, or is it to bring it into a game engine, for example? Anyway, I hope that this video has been useful for you, and thank you for watching.